Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we've got an interesting speaker to look at. This is what is now considered a vintage B&W speaker, and this model is the 802, and it's the 802 S2 version, so second version of this thing. And I've got it up here on the lift table so you can take a look at the whole speaker, and I'm going to lower this thing down to where you can see all of it. Obviously a floor standing three-way speaker, and it uses some type of I think those may be a paper cone driver. As far as the woofers, they're tuned fairly low. The box is really well braced. This is kind of in their Matrix series design where there's a lot of bracing going on in there. Then they're using their bulletproof Kevlar, which is part of their advertising campaign at the time. It's bulletproof. And the little tweeter pod that sits up there on the top of it. And I will say that this modular design was a little bit ahead of its time back then. They did some things really well, and they produced a pretty good product to a point. There's also some shortcomings on this thing. And I remember going back to the B&W dealers way back in the day and listening to a lot of B&W products. And I'll never forget going into a store there in Oklahoma City where they had some 801 set up, which is basically the same speaker, but it had a single 12 or 15-inch woofer underneath it. And they had it on some Krell amps, and they had some big monstrous bi-wire cable on there. And I remember them telling me that the cable was $5,000 for the cable. And I remember thinking, if only they knew what was on the inside of that speaker. They're hooking these $5,000 cables onto the back of binding posts that had steel nuts on the back of them and cheesy, just common electrical wire and super cheesy parts on the inside. Man, I've been into a lot of these B&Ws, and especially the older models. This is what was on the inside. And on this one, it's easy to get to this thing because you can remove the bottom panel, and this whole thing is just right there mounted to the bottom like this, so you can unscrew it and remove the whole thing. And there's probably just enough space in there to go in and build a whole new network to install in that same area. The old Crossovers has about 54 parts on it, and it has common electrical wiring going to push-on connectors here, or I should say crimp-down connectors that's got steel nuts on them as well. All of the inductors are iron core except the one that was on the tweeter. Most of the capacitors are all electrolytic capacitors. All the resistors are all the cheap sandcast resistors. There's a little protection circuit with diodes and tiny little resistors that are going on the tweeters and the mids or something there. It's just garbage, to be honest with you. Even the circuit board itself isn't a copper trace circuit board. This is just aluminum or tin or something. It's just, you look at it and you just cringe when you see this stuff. Now, the overall design of it, as far as getting this out of the way, as far as quality, is fairly okay. Like, it has a fairly balanced response across the board. And unlike some of the B&W models, which the little tweeters rang like crazy at the top, I didn't see that in this model. So this would be one of the lesser fatiguing models to listen to. But it does have a little bit of brightness right around 1,000 to 1,100 hertz. There is a peak. Let's take a look at it. This is the on-axis frequency response, and overall linearity is pretty good. And the tweeter is voiced down a little bit, so if it was put in an overly bright room, it wouldn't completely take your head off. But that little spot there around 1 to 1,100 hertz, 1 kHz to 1,100 hertz is definitely going to be a bit of brightness. Looking at it individually, so we can look at the woofers independent of the mid tweeters, we can see that it crossed at about 360 hertz, which is not that bad. I wouldn't want to run these things up very high. You've got a small woofer that's capable of going down fairly low. You should let it do what it can do, and that's pretty much what they did. Now, here's some of the good parts about the design. This modular design minimizes surface reflections quite a bit, and it will really help improve imaging and soundstage layering because you don't have as much surface reflection. So without all the surface reflection, you don't get the sound as if it's coming from the baffle. It becomes a little more transparent because you just don't have these reflections coming forward with the on-axis response. So looking at the vertical off-axis, it looks really, really good. That means as you're moving up, that the close center to center spacing of the drivers really helps in that they stay in phase over a pretty good range. So they did a good job there. And the horizontal off-axis looks great. And on all of these models that we've measured that have these different pods on there and this no surface area around anything, they've always had pretty good off-axis response. Everything drops off fairly evenly. Looking at the spectral decay, it looks fairly clean. There's a little bit of a humped up area there at that spot where there's a peak between 1,000 and 1,100 hertz, that little spot there. It's a little heavier there, but it's not bad. And down in the woofer's response there, there's a little bit of stored energy there, but it's not bad at all. So that wouldn't be too intrusive. It would make vocals a little heavy, but overall, not too bad. And that peak there at between 1,000 and 1,100 hertz is going to bring a little brightness to the top of female vocals that may want to, it's going to be a little added zing there. Looking at the impedance, we can see that it was tuned fairly low, down in the low 20s, and the impedance dropped to 3.9 ohms. So it's definitely going to require an amplifier that is stable down into 4 ohms. So, my job is to try and improve the sound of these things. That's why they're sent in to me. And we know we're not going to replicate this thing and we're going to get this garbage out of the signal path. So my first job in going about the evaluation is to look at the individual driver responses and see what kind of range that they function in and see if I'm going to have to go in and correct for a bunch of stuff and get a good idea of what I'm working with. So I'll shoot the drivers independently. I'll shoot the tweeter, the mid, and then the woofers, and look at the spectral decay so I can know if I've got stored energy issues that I got to deal with and things like that. So let's throw this up. Let's look at the tweeter's response and the spectral decay of the tweeter right under it. We can see that there's a little bit of a humped up area in the tweeter's response, but that's something I can correct. Most importantly, in the spectral decay, we don't see a whole lot of ringing going on there, so that's good. Looking at the mid-range response is a little choppy, and it definitely has a loss of output as you go down further. And when you put something in a pod like this, you're going to have a lot of what we call step loss. That means that there's no added gain from the surface area because there is no surface area. So at about 1,000 hertz, the output starts to wrap around and become omnidirectional, and when it does that, it loses outputs. That's why you see everything below that range is just falling off. And then we've got a couple of little humps there, around 1,000 to a little over 2,000, and then there's a little big peak at the top. But looking at the spectral decay with it, we can see that the only place we have to concern ourselves with stored energy was right there around 1,000 hertz. That's right there where that peak was before, and it looks like it's got a little bit of ring to it, not just an amplitude peak. Looking at the woofer's response, that looks kind of rough. And I'm still taking these measurements on tweeter axis. So I'm up here on the tweeter axis. The two woofers are below, and you can see a huge suck out at around 2 kHz. That's the time arrival difference from one woofer to the other up there at that height. So that's what's causing that huge hole. If I were to drop down on woofer axis, it wouldn't have that. But when we're designing the crossover, we're basing everything on the output at the tweeter, so that's what it looks like at that position at 1 meter. And when we go down lower in frequency, those wavelengths are much longer and they don't cancel each other. They're barely out of phase from the other. It's like it's just a little bit of phase rotation because the wavelengths are much, much longer than they are at 2 kHz. 2 kHz are like 6 inches long, but way down here in the range where we're going to use this thing, these things are, 10, 12 feet long. So the differential between the arrival of one to the other is no big issue at all. So yeah, the spectral decay looks really rough. There's a lot of ringing and stuff going on, but it's well out of the range that we're going to be using it. So of all the things on this thing, the lower range on these woofers looks really good. So Next, it was see what I can do with it. So I put a crossover together that functioned well with these drivers, and let's throw a crossover graph up there so we can take a look at it. And you can see I pushed the crossover point between the mid-bass driver and the woofers down a little further. They were at about 360, and I pushed it down to around 240 or something like that, which that little woofer is perfectly capable of. That's no issue for that driver at all. Notice I was able to get a nice balanced response, and there was a few notch filters in that mid-range driver, mid-bass driver's response there, or in its circuit that notched out some of that stuff, and I was able to do away with any of those humps and the ringing. Looking at just the on-axis response alone, it looks fantastic. I mean, it really does. It's extremely accurate now with the crossover that I put on there. And then looking at the vertical off-axis, we can see it's even better. Going up and down, it maintains its response over the whole room vertically. And then on the horizontal off-axis, again, drops off extremely well. It's one of those speakers you can put into the room, and no matter where you're sitting in the room, you're going to get a very accurate representation of what you would get even if you were on the on-axis. So that was great. Spectral decay now looks a lot cleaner. If you look even down low, where there was some heaviness that would have created heaviness in the vocal, it's not there anymore. It's going to be a lot cleaner and a lot smoother. You're going to get a lot better detail and resolution that was covered up before because those drivers were still ringing and still carrying those notes well past the input signal. Not the case anymore. And then looking at the impedance curve, we can see that it only drops to 4.9 ohms now. So I was able to do some stuff with it to keep it a little bit higher in impedance, so it's a little friendlier for a bunch of amplifiers that you might drive it with. So overall, I was able to balance out the response really, really well and in every direction. The crossover quality is going to go up a lot, and it's going to go from 54 parts to 15 parts. So I was able to do a lot more with a lot less, and we're going to do all air core inductors on the mid-bass driver and the tweeter. We're going to do a really large laminated I-core, a super Q coil, on the lower woofers, and good quality parts throughout. No more sandcast resistors and all that. No more of this junk that's in there. And these, oh my goodness, these were the type of bonding posts that you saw often with the bare wire just pushed into it and you screw it down to tighten it on it. It would also take a spade and it would take a banana plug, but we're going to do away with that and just put one set of tube connectors on there and get all of that out of the signal path. So no more of this stuff. That's going to improve clarity quite a bit. Good wiring. I'll re-examine what's going on inside and see if there's even any way we can add no-res. The way this thing has that structural bracing thing going through it, it's going to be very difficult. But when I pull this back apart, I'll really look at it and see if there's ways we can get in there and kind of help damp this out a little bit better. But we'll see. So we're going to put a whole package together. You can look for it on the website. And for all of you guys that have these things, this is going to be a very, very significant improvement in performance across the board. I mean, lots better clarity. Down in that vocal region where all that heaviness was, all that's going to be gone. You're going to hear much better definition and clarity. And then all the way up there across the top end where all these parts were smearing the signal, you're going to hear a lot better resolution and clarity. So this one was a nice, fun little project. It'll be a fun little project for you guys. The crossover should still fit in the bottom of the box, and you're going to have to do some rewiring on this stuff and feeding the wires down through the passage, and it's a little bit of a pain in the rear end to get it through there, but you can rewire this whole thing. And yeah, look for it on our website if you're interested. If you've got any comments, please drop them in the comment section below. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I know these upgrade videos are kind of a highlight. Not only do you see what we're doing, but you get to see what these original speakers were and how they measured and what was inside of them. I know that's a lot of fun sometimes too. So I really appreciate you guys watching, and if you hadn't subscribed, please do, and we'll see you in the next video.